to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis, continuing our ongoing conversations about the cultures of consciousness. And a reminder, these conversations have been going on for over 7 years now, and you can access the archive both at prn.org and my own techgnosis.com, techgnosis.com, and that's where I have tons of my old writings as well. So it's quite an archive now. I'm pretty proud of it, and we go on. My life was irrevocably transformed in July of 1983 when I went up to Ventura County Fairgrounds, my home in San Diego, and saw the Grateful Dead for the first time. And Ventura County Fairgrounds is a very special place to see the band. Because it was right alongside of the water, the ocean. And basically, once you crossed into the parking lot, there were no cops. So somehow they managed to kind of chisel out this place, and people were like crashing, not just in their cars and the inevitable VW buses, but also in like the stables. People were sleeping on the beach. And it was an old rodeo ring. So it had bleachers on one side and then a dirt field. And what was most great about it for me was not just the introduction to the music and to the vibe and all the people and all the crazy characters that were still in California in the early 1980s before the Grateful Dead kind of exploded in 87, in the late 80s. So it was, it was quite a great immersion in California hippiedom. But my favorite thing about the shows, the thing that really transformed me more than anything, was that they had the sound stage in the middle of the rodeo field. So if you were behind it was pretty big. So if you were behind the sound stage, you couldn't see the band. And so, I just kind of stumbled in there. And discovered that was where all the really serious dancers were hanging out, because they didn't want to look at the stage and they didn't want to have everybody facing one direction. And so I just found myself bouncing around like this cosmic pinball in this amazing collective dance scene. And I still remember the way a lot of these people looked. I remember the looks in their eyes when they'd look at me in my eyes, and we'd be picking up moves from each other. I mean, it was really a deep immersion, very, very embodied immersion in the kind of full range of the unspoken communication with other people, other beings, and of course, with this marvelous, bizarre, sometimes corny, sometimes janky music that the band was making, and it remains a significant part of my listening life, and has been continuously since those early years. But it was funny, even though I'm also a scholar and a pop culture critic, and I like to read a lot of critical theory, and I'm kind of these guys. I didn't really know how deep one of the many rabbit holes associated with the Grateful Dead goes, and this is the rabbit hole of Grateful Dead scholarship. So it's not just that, any band that has some importance, there's some people out there who've written a book or some articles or whatever. No. It may be the case that the Grateful Dead is the most studied band of anything in the rock and roll generation. I think maybe even more than Dylan, although, it depends on what you mean by study, because of course, one of the things about being a Grateful Dead fan is that you were a Grateful Dead critic right from the ball game. That was one of the first things I learned. You could say, that show sucked, or I love that Jack Straw was great, or, that Dark Star 2 weeks ago was better than any of this stuff, or whatever. It's like it encouraged that kind of vibe. But it's really gotten quite installed inside popular culture discourse, of course, musicology, literature even. And so I decided to dip my toes in with Listening for the Secret, The Grateful Dead and the Politics of Improvisation by Ulf Olsson, who's our guest today, who's a professor of comparative literature at Stockholm University in Sweden. And this book is the first, number one, of the Studies in the Grateful Dead series from the University of California Press, which is one of my favorite academic presses. They do a lot of stuff on magic and mysticism and interesting religion, as well as some good pop culture stuff and some good California stuff. So it was quite a treat to read, to have these sort of different worlds in my own brain come together. I never thought I would be reading about, Jerry Garcia and Adorno in one text, and it was a delightful experience. And I'm happy that I managed to get Ulf to be on Expanding Mind. So with no further ado, Ulf, welcome to Expanding Mind.
Thank you, Erik. It's nice to be here, and I get so envious of you. I wanted to be at that Ventura show too, but I wasn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was one of the places just to start off is in your own personal life, growing up in Sweden. When did you come across the Dead? What did they seem like to you, and how did you get drawn into the fold?
Yeah, well, it's the Dead and Sweden is a special story, of course, but my personal experience is that I started to listening to the Dead in the late 60s. I had a friend who was sort of well-off. He came from a well-off family, and he could buy any record he wanted. And he had those early albums, but we didn't understand them really. But we were so fascinated by them, and we were looking at those covers, trying to sort of decipher them. But then with Live Dead, the first double live album that they issued in, was it 70? And then, of course, Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, that changed it. So you sort of grew into it. And I really enjoyed the Dead in the early 70s. I tried to catch them live. I hitchhiked to Europe in order to see them in France, but I came a day or two too late. So that was a bummer, of course. Then Bob Weir showed up in Stockholm in the early 80s. He was supposed to bring his own band at the time, Bobby and the Midnights, to Sweden and to Stockholm, but only him came. And I did an interview with him. So that was my start on writing about the Grateful Dead. I was already at that time a grad student in comparative literature, but improvised music and music is, of course, a big interest. And then the Grateful Dead actually did come to Sweden and to Stockholm in 1990. It's often looked upon as a mediocre show. They were jet-lagged. They didn't take off really, but it's okay. It wasn't great. But I did also then an interview, this time with Phil Lesh, and it was really interesting. I sort of wrote more essays on the Dead in Swedish, and then I came to California these last 8 years, I think it is, and I find that there is a sort of living culture here still centered around the Grateful Dead, or in connection, related to the band, its history. So that is my sort of history with the Grateful Dead.
Well, and I'd also like to hear, just before we get into your book, and it's interesting that you're a comparative literature guy, but you spend relatively small amount of time discussing the lyrics, and you're much more going into the questions of improvisation, which is a theme on our show. Actually, we do music shows, not that often, but almost always they involve some question of improvisation, which seems to me to be really one of the key topics today for a number of reasons. So I actually appreciate the way in which you didn't get caught up in the lyrics overly, and really was looking more at social practices and this question of politics, which is a fascinating one when we think about the Dead. But before we get into those questions, I'd love to hear a little snapshot of how you see this kind of pretty healthy subgenre or niche within scholarship, within academia, of people looking at the Grateful Dead. I mean, when did that really start rolling? When was there kind of a central event, or what makes that a particularly what gives it its own character in terms of comparison with other sorts of academic scenes that you're familiar with?
That's a good question. The Grateful Dead scholarship is a sort of a loose community of scholars that are really supportive. And that makes it a little different, I think, from other scholarly communities that I've sort of been in touch with, where competition might be more to the fore. But the Grateful Dead scholarship, of course, has its history. Musicologists have written about the band, of course. There are important studies by people like David Malvini and Graham Bone and others. But they tend, of course, to be a little of the sort of technical side for us that are not into musicology. But I've sort of happened to see that there was a conference on popular culture in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and there was a Grateful Dead session. And I found out that it was, I think at the time, the 16th consecutive session on the band in that. So it has been going on for at least about 20 years now. And there is a Grateful Dead Scholars Caucus that sort of meets there. You don't get a formal membership, but it's easy to sort of become part of it. And as I said, it's a very supportive kind of atmosphere there. And people share really their views on the band. And so, yes, there is already an existing scholarship on the band. And I mean, I'm presently at the University of California in Berkeley, and it seems like every other professor here is an old Deadhead. So it's sort of a widespread culture. And cultural theory, critical theory has been applied to the band in many different essays throughout the years. So I'm not the first to do that, but I think this is the first sort of book of this kind that uses critical theory in order to take a more whole vision of the band.
Yeah, no, I think you pulled it off. It was really really interesting and often quite insightful and surprising. Particularly the problem of understanding a politics. What does it mean to talk about politics in relationship to a band that at least superficially was very anti-political? But I thought maybe a better way to approach this conversation is to start off talking just about improvisation and improvisation in the Dead's music and how that was sort of reflected in various social practices. And then maybe through that we can start to peel off some of the more explicit political questions that I definitely also have, because I've been very interested in kind of the question of what a sort of California countercultural politics is really about, which is a lot more complicated than I think people often take it for, and I think the Dead are really representative of that. But in terms of improvisation, what did you want to bring to the table? Since clearly people in the Dead scholarship world have been talking about improvisation, some more in musicological terms, some more in kind of cultural or even spiritual terms. What about improvisation for you was the sort of that? Why was that going to be the hook in terms of your engagement with the Dead in this book? And then we can just start talking about some of the unique things about improvisation in the band, because of course improvisation means many things in many different contexts.
Right, and it's as you suggest, a very complex aspect of music in general, and also of the Grateful Dead's music. Then, so but what I like about the Grateful Dead is precisely when they sort of go for the unknown, where you feel that they are exploring something, and it's not based on the actual tune so much. They can refer to it, but they can also leave it totally, or could. And this is, I think, especially the first half of the 70s, they were fantastic at doing this. And the way that they could take the music to new places to give it new meaning then. So that one can really wonder what improvisation is. I mean, they are not just a jam band. I think that people tend to look at improvisation as sort of, you just hum along and you jam a little and then it's improvised music, but it's really not so much that. I don't look at the Grateful Dead as a jam band exactly. They rehearsed a lot. They worked with their music so much, and I think Phil Lesh has said also that you don't play the way we play without having a theoretical knowledge of what music is and how to form music. So they discussed it a lot. They listened to their own music and they learned how to do things and how to communicate musically. And it's interesting also that we tend to think of improvisation as free, as something that you voluntarily enter, but you can also look at improvisation, I think, as a sort of a coercion. And Jerry Garcia often talked about that we don't have a choice. We have to improvise because that's just what we are. So it has had to do with sort of the band's form of existence itself. They were improvising. And I think that has a lot to do with the era, the time, what happened in jazz music during the 60s, for instance. They often return to the importance of listening to John Coltrane and Miles Davis. I mean, Miles Davis opened for the Grateful Dead several nights at the Fillmore. It's insane, actually. As Phil Lesh suggested in his memoir, they should have been the other way around. The Grateful Dead opened for Miles Davis, of course. But that improvisation sort of was in the air. It was part of what was going on in the 60s in an interesting way, I think.
And one, of course, the one of the great tensions in the band is the fact that in addition to these improvisatory openings, whether some of them more jammy, let's say they're staying on one chord or two chords and they're kind of playing around the tune, sort of deconstructing it. And then sometimes, as you say, particularly in the early 70s, but, quite often later on, really unexpected music, really strange sounds, sometimes clashing, sometimes dissonant, sometimes often very unpredictable. And at the same time, and this is what sets them apart from a lot of other kinds of improvised music. In fact, I can't think of anything that's similar to them in this regard. They have this rhetoric of tradition, playing these old popular tunes, and playing them often over and over again, almost identically. So in the same show where you'd have a nice half an hour playing in the band, you're going to get, as you describe in the book many times, one of the 613 recorded renditions of Me and My Uncle, which, you're probably not that interested in when it's come down the pike because it pretty much sounds the same. I mean, they don't change it that much. And so there's this weird balance between this one zone of whether you want to think about it as freedom or an interesting kind of coercion or a kind of necessity. But you have this openness of the improvisation. But there's also this profound relationship, not just with actual traditions, cowboy tunes, folk songs, but just even to the idea of tradition, the kind of way in which even their original material, particularly stuff from Working Man's Dead and American Beauty, that material itself feels traditional, feels like some evocation of an earlier time. So there's this very strange relationship that I don't really think of as in any other band out there at all. And that seems to be also what partly makes their improv so interesting, is that there's this relationship with tradition at the same time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's interesting to think of all these versions of the same songs and how many times they perform them. It might have to do, I think, sometimes with there's this desire for the perfect ultimate version of, say, Me and My Uncle or something. But they, of course, never find it. They have to try it again and again. And it has something to do, I might suggest, with craftsmanship. How to sort of make the best out of every piece that forms a band. And it was so important within also this countercultural culture that they were sort of part of, to make it yourself. So you had to sort of try to form it the way you wanted it, and to do it from scratch and build it that way. So it had to do something with, like a carpenter wants to make his object, the house he's building or something, as good as possible. And you want to do that with all these songs also. And that is, of course, rooted in tradition. And I try to look upon a little in my book on how the band's relationship, and especially Garcia's perhaps, to bluegrass, which is also a community building kind of music.
Yeah, and also a very modern kind of traditional music. That's one of the things that's so fascinating about bluegrass. But I want to pick up on something you mentioned, this idea of craftsmanship, of this sort of DIY aspect of the band that helped establish or produce their originality. And it again ties in with one of the things that I've been thinking about in a broader sense about the West Coast, about the counterculture, is that there's a very important vein of the counterculture that is pragmatic, that it's not just about tearing down the walls and creating a revolution and getting as high as you possibly can, but it's about reworking existing materials in new ways. Some people talk about countercultural bricoleurs, people who are putting together even derelict systems in new ways. And indeed, part of the whole ethos of the Whole Earth Catalog, of Stuart Brand's sort of ideology, and a lot of the ecological and communal aspects of the times really had to do with this kind of creative pragmatism, where you take things from the past, you take old technologies, but you find new ways to use them, and that construction is part of how you construct a new society or a new consciousness or a new way for human beings to be together. And so it's remarkable when you look at the 60s and early 70s, the amount of this kind of creative craftsmanship collectively that's happening. And it kind of goes away in a lot of ways, or it becomes other things. It becomes, Google and Apple in its own way, but it also becomes the Grateful Dead. There's a way in which they keep a space for a kind of collective making that has this improvisatory element, not just in terms of going off and playing tunes, but of how to put things together in new ways.
Yeah, and this pragmatism, as you suggest, has a lot to do with technology, to find ways of doing things. And we should remember, I think, that improvisation in popular music, or in music in general, partly was made possible by a technological innovation, namely the long-playing album. And with the LP, you could have 23 minutes of Dark Star on one side of a record. So the culture industry, in a way, welcomed this kind of music then. And also another aspect which is about technology is the band's interest in sounding as good as possible, and how much they invested in the PA system, in the wall of sound in the early 70s, and how they've always been sort of on the technological forefront, trying to make everyone hear as well as possible. And this is also, of course, what makes improvisation possible, that you could hear yourself on stage. But when you play for 50,000 people in a sports arena, it gets a little more difficult to hear what you're doing, actually. You can't listen to each other the same way that you can do in an arena for 5,000 people or something. But technology makes... It's a really important aspect, I think, of what makes the Grateful Dead such an interesting band.
Yeah, and it's a paradox as well, because of course mostly, or at least for a lot of people for the people who are buying records and not necessarily at the show, or even if they go to the show and then they buy a record, but the record is of a live show, that the idea of improvisation, of being free of something unexpected, of the spontaneous, of the unknown, is sort of paradoxically inscribed into something that's designed to be repeated over and over. So there's already this weird loop or trace within the Grateful Dead's ethos of improvisation, where it's always already recorded. And then of course with the tapers and the kind of encouragement essentially to record shows by people to do it, DIY recordings, and that those recordings then get listened to over and over again. So again, it's this kind of complexity that you're so good at getting to in the book, is where there's a tension between these, maybe the idealization of improvisation as freedom and spontaneity and the unknown, but it's also always bound up with some kind of constraint or inscription or some feature of the culture industry, including technology.
Yeah, there's a dialectic at work here, I think. I mean, improvised music is always situated. It's always sort of in this room at this time, and it is happening at this very moment. But then recordings, of course, unsituates music. It makes it possible to listen to them in your car or in your home, and you can stream music, etc., etc. So it has become something else then. And this is an interesting problem, I think, for improvised music. Jerry Garcia used to say that when we're done with it, they can have it, meaning that the audience could do whatever it wanted with the music when the musicians had finished it. But this, as you point to this, that improvised music becomes repeatable is strange in a way. One should really listen to improvised music on record only once and then throw away the record or something in order to keep it more situated then. But there is also other forms of dialectic at work here, I think. I mean, improvisation is, we talked about tradition, and improvisation can be a form of remembrance that you sort of go back to. You pick up things from the past and use it. But it can also be a question of forgetting, to try to forget everything that you've learned in order to do something new. And there's that tension also in the Grateful Dead's music, I think, that they sort of celebrate and memorializes the tradition that they come out of, but they also try to transgress it and to forget about it.
Yeah, very much. One of the words you use a lot when describing the effect of particularly the more improvised aspects of their music, and I thought it was very insightful, was the word delay. Improvisation can have different effects in different kinds of contexts, but definitely with the Dead, there was the sense of like, we're not going to go back to the song yet. We're not going to go back to the familiar riff yet. And even more, sometimes we're not even going to let you know what we're playing on. And that's where you get to this, like the whole importance in the Dead, which I always thought was really a really significant part, was the sort of in-between songs where they're kind of diddling around a little bit, tuning up and kind of making noise. And it's like, as a part of the game as an audience, is to sit there and go, okay, what are they going to play? And you hear a chord and you go, oh, this might becomes a time or whatever. And there's this sense that they were sort of playing with anticipation. There's a lot of playing with anticipation. And even Garcia's solo style, I mean, he has a unique guitar style. But I think one of the features of it, this was illuminated by a guitarist friend of mine who didn't like Jerry. He thought he didn't enjoy his playing. He said, he never really resolves what he's doing. He never really lands. And in a way, it's true. He kind of refuses. He has his own kind of delay going even in the midst of his solos, in addition to what the band's doing. So there's something in that delay that's both playful and even a little, kind of combative. There's something in there where they're kind of teasing the audience. So what was important about that sense of delay, do you think? Like where did that come from? What does that tell us about what the band was up to?
Well, I think teasing is an important element, not only directed towards the audience, to us listening, but also to each other, that you sort of try an idea with the rest of the band. And then those players can sort of choose whether to respond, and then everyone goes into the tune or something, or they can deny it to answer it. And then you have to move on. And there's the delay then, that they refuse. It's a sort of refusal to get into the order, I think.
Which is a politics too, because it's a refusal to get into what the culture industry, as you put it earlier, what they expected or wanted, what the normal routine was. You put out records. There's short songs that go on the radio. You go on tour. You repeat the things that are on the radio, and then people feel they recognize it. And so that part of this refusal was a gesture against a whole kind of order of cultural production. And that's a lot of what your book is about, but before I actually want to read a section that's exactly talking about this, because I thought it was one of the most insightful and interesting about improvisation and the way in which it's refusing or resisting. Improvisation will never get there. It is always too late or too early. It will not take you home. Improvisation emits a promise of happiness, as does art in general, but that promise is always betrayed. Improvisation denies closure and instead destroys. But this destruction is not only musical in the sense of a transgression of the given parameters of a given song, it is destructive also in that it refuses to acknowledge such a basic assumption of Western music as even the song format. Improvisation is a critique of reification. So I bring that partly to get to some of these political issues. What do you mean about improvisation as a critique of reification in this sense?
Well, you actually already said it yourself, I think, when you discussed Jerry Garcia's way of playing, that he sort of denies closure. And improvisation is a way of keeping things open, while commodification is a way of closing things down so that they become marketable and sellable and you can take them home, etc. So improvisation sort of is a refusal to become objectified that way. But of course, the culture industry then produces CDs that can have almost 80 minutes of music on them. So it is always a sort of changing climate, a changing tension between the artist's way of trying to keep control of their own work and the culture industry's desire to distribute it and make a profit out of it then. And this is, of course, constantly changing. It's not, we can't say that the Grateful Dead solved anything. There's no solution to find here. But they practiced something that is inspiring, I think, in this kind of refusal.
Oh, very much so. So I want to get into a little bit more of the politics of it. So that was really the interesting twist in your story, is that, yeah, you could have a discussion of the Grateful Dead and improvisation, how it works musically, how it plays with audiences, how it plays with tradition. But you go farther and say, okay, well, let's look at this politics, not just in terms of the antagonistic relationship with the culture industry, which in some sense always wins in the end, but there's this kind of space of resistance or space of refusal. That's important. But there's a lot more to be said about the Grateful Dead and politics, despite the fact that on the surface, of course, they're the most apolitical 60s band you can imagine. They actively, with some exceptions, refuse to be parts of political campaigns. They don't preach from the stage. You don't even really know what their opinions are about a lot of stuff. And yet there's a profound politics in the way that they practice with each other as a band, the way they dealt with their own business, with the Grateful Dead family, with the relationships with people within the organization, and then, of course, the way they dealt with the audience and the unique relationship with fans, with travelers, with people making their own T-shirts, all the sort of stuff that comes out of it, particularly, in the earlier part of the band. So, when you set out to answer this question, what are the politics of the Grateful Dead? Where did you start to look for? Where do you feel like is the key places to sort of unpack what kind of politics this, avowedly anti-political band actually had?
Well, I think one starting point was a remark made by the band's official biographer, Dennis McNally, who has also published the best band history of the band. And he says somewhere that the Grateful Dead is so intimately connected to the dislocations of the 60s. And he was then thinking of gender, race, and class. So these dislocations, that said something was about improvisation. Improvising is a way of dislocating the known, the already known, and making it strange and making it new in a way. So there I found something. And of course, the Grateful Dead were stubbornly apolitical, but they performed a political function. And in order to understand that, I realized that we had to sort of try to look at what politics might be from a different angle and don't think of it as Democrats and Republicans, that's blue or red states. It's not even about socialism and capitalism in any basic sense. It's not about who is president or not, etc. That is not politics in the Grateful Dead community then. But they performed a political function in that they opened up a space where people could do something else and become something else, a space where we could sort of try to form ourselves. And I think a lot of popular culture fills that function in many ways, but the Grateful Dead established that sort of space much more wider, much more important than most other popular cultural phenomena does, actually. So there is the opening, I think, that they they created this space for us where we could form ourselves.
And one of the ways you talk about that that I think is very important is the way in which they were aware of the traps of rock stardom, the traps of charisma, of being a guru. And of course, those things kind of happened anyway. You know, when I first started seeing the band, there was already a whole kind of rhetoric around Jerry and the people who were on like the Jerry side of the stage, and Jerry's a bodhisattva, he's a guru, you know, whatever. There was already that kind of guru stuff. But at the same time, the band went out of their way to squash that. You know, they didn't want to wear flashy clothes. They didn't want to talk very much to the audience. They didn't want to be too explicit even in interviews. So it's like, in order to make that unique political cultural space that you're talking about happen, they also had to do things kind of against the grain as a band to let that happen, in terms of creating a relationship with a particular kind of relationship with the audience.
The band was really aware, I think, of the trappings of being rock stars and what that could imply. And Jerry Garcia talked in some interviews about the sort of fascism that the culture industry supports, and the rock concert as sort of an authoritarian gesture, you know, it's a sort of authoritarian seduction of the audience, and you play as loud as possible, etc., in order to be in control and in power. And he was so much against that, and against the gestures and rhetorics and costumes, etc., of rock stardom then. And they understood then early on that if they wanted to be something else, they needed to work on it. They needed to organize themselves. As you say, they took care of the Grateful Dead family and the whole organization in interesting ways. And since the band has donated its archive to the University of California at Santa Cruz, you can go there and really look at the business papers and the protocols from band meetings, etc., and see how the band really tries to defend itself against the forces that wants it to become something else that it didn't want to be. So self-organization to me is sort of the key issue in order to understand what political might mean when it comes to the Grateful Dead.
I totally agree. You know, but one term that didn't come up in your book, maybe it's there somewhere, but I don't think you certainly didn't discuss it extensively, is the word libertarian. Because, and I'll give you just a little brief riff here, is that one of the ways I think we get the 60s wrong is that there's sort of the standard story where there were the new left activists, you know, the Berkeley rabble-rousers and the radicals on the one hand, and on the other hand, you had the Hate Street hippies who were interested in new consciousness and in living a new lifestyle, and in not fighting against the powers that be, but in creating their own society. And usually that's seen as apolitical, kind of the way the Grateful Dead is seen as apolitical. But I also, for me, it's always been like, well, you know, we can actually understand this partly in terms of a kind of, maybe not very theorized, but a certain kind of anarchism, or even a certain kind of libertarianism. And of course, John Perry Barlow, who wrote a lot of the lyrics for the Bob Weir tunes, was himself, you know, not only a Republican, which is sort of coming from Wyoming doesn't necessarily mean that much, but was also very much of a libertarian. And my way of reading that partly, I mean, I would never put them in the camp of the libertarian, but I think you can understand part of this deeper California current of self-organization, a certain kind of autonomy, a certain kind of anarchism, a certain kind of DIY that has to do with the idea that regardless of how the world is, that some of the way to be political is to organize yourself, to do it yourself, to make it work for you and your community, which, you know, has some negative sides as well. But to what extent do you think that we can see the band both in its positive and I think in some ways negative sides as you know, actually kind of principled in their, we can call it anarchism, we can call it libertarianism?
Yeah, well, you're right in that I don't go into the question of libertarianism. I think it's so American. I mean, I'm a Swede. I have difficulties to get into what does libertarianism really mean here. But I think that might be one of the sort of root threads for this culture. Then is the libertarian tradition that, but you can also look at the band's way of organizing itself and see that it really contradicts libertarianism, I think. I mean, for instance, they were so careful to make sure that every employee had a health insurance. Is that libertarianism or is it something else there? So it is, once again, this complexity of things here that is so interesting.
Yeah, the quote that you have, I can't remember. I think Joel Sylvan might have said it was the anarchist pirate ship, and that for me that does it. Is that there's an anarchism in terms of not wanting to tell anybody what's going on. You know, they don't want to tell the audience how to behave. They don't want to tell each other how to behave. In fact, I think that's actually one of the key ways into their own politics, if you will, is the way in which the band did not really discipline itself very much or discipline others in the band. So that with the exception of the Mickey Hart early 70s story, that's a kind of different domain. But I think it's instructive that, Bob Weir was Jerry's heroin bag man until the end. So Bob Weir was not willing to go, hey, Jerry, I think this stuff's going to kill you. Maybe you should stop. Or maybe he would say that, but no one's going to make a move. Because on some basic level, people are allowed their own way through the world. You don't try to control other people. But at the same time, like you say, it's a pirate ship. It's not just those guys, but it's the family, the larger organization, the roadies, whatever. So it's not individualism, which is why libertarian doesn't quite work. It's like a social anarchism. It's a very strange but strangely powerful kind of mix, and it's hard to generalize from it. And I guess one of the questions is, if it was an anarchist pirate ship, was the audience on the ship, or was the audience just watching the ship go by and dancing in its wake?
Well, that's a good question, and it has to do, of course, with the division of labor. In the early days, the band really wanted the audience to be part of the band in a sense, that there should be no dividing line really between band music and audience. But of course that is impossible to uphold when you grow more popular. And I mean, also a pirate ship has to be navigated in some sense. You have to know where you're going, etc. So the band members didn't want to police each other, but they felt a sort of difficult but still important urge to police the audience. I mean, when they became so popular, they also had an audience that didn't know how to be a deadhead audience, that didn't have the ethos of the sort of community that the band belonged to and came out of. So they started to police the audience, and they didn't want to do it, but they had to do it. I mean, people were gate crashing into concerts, and there were lots of troubles about security when they became so immensely popular in the late 80s. So once again, there is this tension between the anarchist ethos that the band tried to uphold. And Phil Lesh says in his memoirs, I think it is, that the Grateful Dead really was the last surviving aspect of the 60s, but that it was so important that at least something survived, and that was the Grateful Dead culture then. So there's a tension between that and this popularity and the strain that put on things then.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you do talk a fair amount in the book about what happens after they get popular in the late 80s, and that's when you can kind of see the decline of a lot of what made them unique in relationship to crowds and the musical form, improvisation. They don't take off as much. So that, in a way, tells us a somewhat familiar story about initial novelty and questioning and critical a critical and creative approach to the world that then gradually becomes kind of commodified and absorbed. But that's not entirely the story. So even though my own I kind of stopped seeing the band in the 90s, and I'd occasionally go just for the parking lot scene, really, because I found the music. I didn't like the MIDI stuff so much. I didn't really like the big stadium so much. But there's something there too. What for you is the interesting part of the last 5, 6, 7 years of the band's life in the early 90s in terms of the issues of improvisation and politics that you were talking about? Where do you see something really kind of that maybe doesn't get as much attention, or that you think is really, really interesting with that late period?
Well, I can't really say that I think that they were that good at improvisation in these years. Occasionally they could take off. I mentioned in my book a show with a saxophonist, David Murray, that is really fantastic, when he triggers the band to go somewhere, some new places. What it strikes me as so typical of the late era Grateful Dead is, of course, the growing sense of melancholy there. Jerry Garcia could hardly play the guitar sometimes. His fingers were so stiff and ached so much that he could hardly hold his instrument sometimes, but he could sing. And the song becomes much more important as such, I think. And also, you mentioned that you didn't like the MIDI stuff, and I don't either. I like the band to sound more natural in a way. So they sort of hid behind the sounds that they could make. The MIDI became sort of a disguise, I think. And the band really wasn't there.
Yeah, one of the things you talk about is, and I had heard that before, and I know that it might actually be a little folkloric, but I guess it's reported in multiple sources how they each had individual ear monitors and to hear better. And that almost everyone in the band requested that the loudest source be in their ears would be their own instruments. So in some sense, they were literally not listening to each other as much as they once were.
Yeah, and that story comes from Dennis McNally, and I think so. Yeah, it's probably true.
Yeah, it's funny. And then the melancholy thing is very interesting. I mean, again, I remember some of the later shows when you'd come to a Jerry ballad, and that really was kind of the center in a lot of ways, because it was where there was the most sort of, I don't know, like the kind of emotional intensity, like something that you might have earlier felt in the midst of a jam with some strange, turn in the music or some intensification of the rhythm or whatever it was, that magic takeoff vibe would often almost more be concentrated in him as a figure, which is kind of ironic given that he was never a great singer, although, good singer, and it certainly wasn't very good towards the end, but there was something there about, Jerry as this particular kind of wounded soul that worked in that late environment.
We talked about improvisation as a form of delay, and they sort of excelled in that in the 70s. They could sort of tease us, and they could hint at where they were going, but they didn't go there. So there was this sense of delay that sort of injected attention into the music. But in the 90s, the music feels often rushed. There is no delay in it. They need to go through a set list, it almost feels like, and the shows are so much shorter. They're down to 2 hours, and that's because of contractual agreements with the promoters and with the union. So they really had to rush through sometimes. And if there were technical problems, they got really rushed, I think. So they lose something there. They're still a good band. And of course, also that means that they became more of a more conventional rock band in a sense, which they had tried to avoid becoming for so long.
For some reason, I'm thinking of a conversation I had with a younger person I know who's a big Fish head. So of course there's all these jam bands that come after the Dead and sort of emulate certain aspects of either their music or their scene and kind of create these pods, spawns and moving in different directions that have a sort of familiar vibe if you were a Deadhead. But for one thing, there's a lot of differences, of course, with these bands. But the one thing, particularly with Fish, which in a way was the most musically ambitious, the most interesting players, both kind of in terms of their mythology and references in their songs and also of their playing, very, very admirable players, not a band I particularly enjoy. But when I was trying to explain to my friend what was different, he was defending Fish, is that the Dead could be, especially back in the day, scary. Something was risked. Something was unnerving in the dislocation. And they weren't going to necessarily grab you, like that whole idea of without a net. I mean, that can refer to like improvising when you're not really sure where you are and you're doing it collectively in front of, 50,000 people. That's definitely living without a net. But there's also almost a psychological, it's not the right word because that's too individual, but there was some sense that even as an audience member, and possibly someone who was, high on drugs, but that doesn't really need to be there either, that there was something risked and that you could get lost in there. And that they seem to retain a proximity to the dark, to something frightening, something uncontrollable in America, in themselves, in drugs, wasn't explicit. And even the lack of explicitness was part of what was scary. That nobody else in that, even close in that jam band, nobody even understands. They can't even try to get there. And your book, you focus on that a couple of times. You talk about the kind of agony that's in there, or the questioning, or the fearfulness that can be in the midst of these jams, particularly in something like Dark Star you talk about, or whatever. But that seemed to me also a really key element that I can't really think of an analog in terms of a group that sort of musically stages this sort of fearful questioning in the midst of what can be such celebratory, joyous music.
Yeah, some people tend to think of the Grateful Dead as sort of this hippy-dippy summer of love, flower in your hair kind of nonsense. It has really nothing to do with the Grateful Dead. And you're right, there is such a big, strong darkness to the music. There is danger there, and they are putting something at stakes then. They take risks then. And I think that's such an important aspect of the band's ethos, I think. And it is, as I try to suggest in my book, that the world is as it is in the work of art. So they have a vision of what it is, the world is, what it is means to be in the world, that they sort of express musically. And it's strange that so few bands does it today. I mean, the world is a darker place today than it was in the 60s, I think. But I tried to compare the Grateful Dead to, which might surprise a little, to Sonic Youth, which was a New York band that came out of the punk scene. But they performed also a political function, and they were the center of a cultural environment that is so similar to what the Grateful Dead did. The aesthetics might differ, even though one of the players of Sonic Youth is really a declared Deadhead and performs on this great 5-CD album, Day of the Dead, that is a sort of run-through of the Grateful Dead's music by other artists. But there is similarity there, and they have the darkness also. I mean, they formulate the chaotic experience of trying to live a daily life in the world as it is today.
I thought that was a very very apt analogy, and even just to be thinking about how they also brought in improvisation and avant-garde gestures into a more popular form in a way that didn't feel smart alecky or latched on or artificially juxtaposed. I mean, it was in the very language of punk rock that sort of, was allowed to sort of flower into these sort of atonal walls of sound and the sort of a flirtation with noise. And it's funny, I've been listening to a lot of shows recently, reading your book and going to Dead shows and going back to the great early 70s period. That's 72, 74 period for me is the primo zone. But listening to particularly Phil during some of these jams where he starts to play chords on the bass, and I'm like, That sounds like Sonic Youth.
Yeah. What interests me so much also, and I think I don't comment upon it that much in my book, but someone should do it, is that the Grateful Dead had such an intense relationship to silence. They could take their music towards silence constantly, and that is such an odd feature in a rock band. I mean, who does that today? Who is sort of aiming for moments of silence right inside the music? And to me, that is such a fascinating quality of the Grateful Dead from the 70s, that is.
Yeah, and what do you think is up with that? I mean, obviously it's like another gesture that's unexpected, and it creates sort of. But it seems like there's more there to that. I mean, it's something that I'm almost tempted to use more cosmic or mystical language. Not that they were interested in fomenting any kind of obvious spiritual schmaltz. But there is a sort of psychedelic spirituality going through the music and the lyrics, a sort of sense of the evanescent, of the deeper question, the cosmic giggle. There's something going on there. And sometimes I hear something like that going on in that silence, in that willingness to not, step in and fill the gap and give the audience something that they can hold on to. What do you think is going on there?
I think it is. To me, I sort of refer to eroticism. It's erotic moments. They are so intimate, and you're so close to something, but you cannot be that other thing, but you're close to it. And that is, to me, an erotic sensation that they actually... I mean, the Grateful Dead is not about sex as so much rock music is. They were pretty bad at that, actually. But eroticism is something else. It's a sensuality in the music there that brings them towards silence, I think.
Yeah, that's a good one. I like that. It's another kind of rolling in the rushes. So are you going to continue to work on the Dead, or is this kind of your Dead book?
This is my Dead book, and I'm leaving that field now.
And just out of curiosity, we only have like a minute here, but just to get a sense, we didn't talk about any of the other things you're interested in. What would your next book? Do you have a plan for the next project, or what you're working on right now?
Yeah. I'm writing a book now on Swedish author and playwright August Strindberg. I've done that a couple of times before, and I'm back to it. And to me, there is a sort of connection between my literary interests, which are sort of not the mainstream ones. I'm not interested in those sort of normal writers. I'm interested in those that take things to the extremes. So there's a sort of connection between my interest in improvisation and in literature. Also, August Strindberg was interested. He lived, 100 years ago. And he was interested in improvisation as a literary feature then. So there is a relationship there. But I should want to add also that this book is the first in a series of studies in the Grateful Dead, and there will be forthcoming other books then written by other people. And I'm really looking forward to those volumes.
Yeah, me too. Well, Ulf, thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Thanks for having me. It was great fun talking to you, Erik.
All right, good luck. And to all you out there listening, keep your minds open.